Hi guys, my name is HK and I will be going over APUSH period 7 to 8, starting off with period 7 from 1890 to 1945. First, starting off with Southern segregation. Elite Southern whites had regained control of state governments, therefore prominent black Republicans had been squeezed out of political positions. Black men were being kept from exercising their right to vote. Segregation became the social norm in the South. There are two famous black rights activists during this period. First, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You can see them on the left over here. However, although they pursued the same goal, their methods were drastically different. For Booker T. Washington argued that African Americans should have a stable economic stance in the American society prior to a political stance, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois argued that African Americans should gain a political and social rights prior to anything else. Woodrow Wilson. He was the president who led America through World War I and who devised the Versailles Treaty's 14 points. Although he proposed the League of Nations, it did not get passed, unfortunately, across the Congress. The Spanish-American War. It occurred between 1898 until 1901. It was the war fought between the U.S. and Spain and Cuba and the Philippines. It started off when the American boat, the Maine, was exploded. This war resulted in Cuba's independence and the U.S. annexation of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Philippine-American War. It happened between 1899 and 1902. It happened quite along with the Spanish-American War. So Emilio Aguinaldo proclaimed Philippine independence so that he wanted Philippines to be a U.S. protectorate. However, the pressure on President William McKinley to annex Philippines was so intense. So because the Filipinos were unable to defeat the U.S. in conventional warfare, the Filipinos adopted guerrilla tactics. Women's suffrage movement, which started around 1848 and continued until 1920s, and this is around the peak where this movement, it reached. So some famous women's rights activists were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Victoria Woodhull, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and Elise Powell. So contrary to the fast and achieving progressive movement during this period, the women's suffrage and rights movement was very slow and gradual, contrary to the progressive movement. But despite of this slowness, the women's rights suffrage movement and the rights movement were able to gain some successes, like the National Women's Suffrage Association, the 19th Amendment, which granted the woman's right to vote, and the Equal Rights Amendment. Preservationists and conservationists. This issue mostly arose between the 1890s and the 1900s. Conservationists were people who were interested in managing natural resources so that future generations might use them later on. However, preservationists argue that nature has intrinsic value and should be maintained in a pristine state. An example of a preservationist was John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club. The Progressive Era. It continued around between 1890s to the 1920s. So the progressives were mostly women, middle class, and city dwellers who sought to expand democracy. And there was some success in that the initiative, referendum, and recall was passed. And also the progressives advocated government intervention in the economy. Reformers. They went along with the progressive movement, so between the 1890s and the 1920s, and they aimed to reform society and politics. And most reformers included cooperative businessmen, labor activists, feminists, and social scientists. And one of their goals was to abolish child labor, as you can see on the left over here. Immigration restriction in the 1920s. So America feared the spread of Soviet communism in the U.S., so immigrant entry to the U.S. was severely limited. The purpose was to preserve the ideal of American homogeneity. Immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe were deported and restrictions were put in place. These immigrants were most severely persecuted because of the Red Scare. And an example of this was the Immigration Act of 1924. Anti-imperialists. So anti-imperialists consisted the Anti-Imperialist League, which was an organization opposed to imperialism of America and the world. Two famous people who were part of the Anti-Imperialist League was Mark Twain, the author of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and William Jennings Bryan, who is most famously known for his Cross of Gold speech. And in the right, you can see Mark Twain over here. U.S. isolationism, 1910s to 1930s. It was the belief that the U.S. should refrain from involvement in overseas affairs and confine its natural security interest to its own borders. And this belief was most prominently shown at the beginning of World War I and II. World War I, 1940 to 1918. Initial stance was U.S. neutralism until the Lusitania U.S. ship was sunk. Also, the German submarine attacks on U.S. ships and passengers heavily contributed to U.S. involvement in the war. And obviously, due to this, the main enemy was Germany. And an example of this was the Zimmermann telegrams, which America thought to be very threatening action of the Germans. And the U.S. was heavily involved in post-war resolutions as part of the Treaty of Versailles. American Expeditionary Force created in 1917. They were U.S. armed forces sent to Europe in World War. They fought in France alongside British and French Allied forces in the last year of the war against Imperial German forces. They helped the French army on the Western Front. The Great Migration, around 1914 to 1930s. It was the movement of African Americans from the south to the north, escaping, and the reasons behind this migration was to escape segregation, racial violence, and to escape limited economic opportunity. And this happened during and after World War I. And as you can see the movement from southern states to destination cities located in the north. The Red Scare, 1918 to 1920. The first Red Scare targeted radicals and immigrants, and it was caused by the Russian Revolution and the labor conflicts that posed a threat to the U.S. government and the citizens of anarchists. The second Red Scare is also known as McCarthyism, and Americans debated policies and methods designed to expose suspected communists within the United States, which was part of the second Red Scare. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919 to 1920. It was created to solve problems made by World War. Germany was forced to accept the treaty, and the treaty heavily punished Germany economically. Therefore, due to this later causes the World War II and the rise of Adolf Hitler. The League of Nations, 1920. Wilson proposed it in the 14 points of its peace plan. However, the U.S. did not join it. It would have taken away self-determination. And also, Congress could not decide whether to go to war or not. And if U.S. did join the League of Nations, it would have ended U.S. imperialism in the world. The Great Depression in the 1930s. It was the economic crisis and period of low business activity in the U.S. It began with the stock market crash in October 1929, also known as the Wall Street crash, and this day is known as the Black Tuesday. This led Hoover defeated in his re-election because Hoover was unsuccessful in providing a resolution to the Great Depression. The Harlem Renaissance movement. It started in the 1920s and throughout the 1930s. The New York City neighborhood of Harlem became a major cultural center. Black artists, musicians, and writers based in Harlem created a social and artistic community. They challenged barriers created by the Jim Crow laws, and some known artists, writers of this period are Duke Ellington, Arna Bottoms, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. The New Deal, 1933 to 1937. It was a program with the goal of relief, recovery, and reform. It was a response to the Great Depression, which was influenced by progressive ideals. One of the goals was that the government would intervene in the economy, so digressing from the laissez-faire economics from the Gilded Age. And however, this was opposed by conservationists and the Supreme Court. But because the New Deal helped the minorities and the poor, African American support of the Democratic Party increased heavily. Pearl Harbor, 1941. It was the Japanese surprise Air Force attack on U.S. naval base in Hawaii. It led to U.S. declaration of war in World War II. Nazi Germany and Japan, 1939 to 1945. They were the aggressor nations of World War II, and they committed numerous atrocities such as human experiments, the Holocaust, and the human experiments included gas chambers, etc. World War II, 1939-1945. The U.S. was neutral until Pearl Harbor, and the World War II ended the Great Depression because the economy was flourishing due to the necessities of military equipments. The World War II resulted in advancements in science and technology, like the Manhattan Project by Oppenheimer, and at the end, U.S. emerged as a world superpower. So these three factors, island hopping, D-Day invasion, and atomic bombs, was part of World War II. So, island hopping. Island hopping was the strategy employed by the United States to gain military bases and to secure the small islands in the Pacific. It was most led by General Douglas MacArthur. D-Day invasion. This was important because it regained France from Nazi Germany. And it was a very successful invasion, indeed, on the front. And atomic bombs. The creation of atomic bombs and U.S. droppings of atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan served to be a precedent for the nuclear power and arms race in the future period as part of the Cold War between the United States and Russia. Japanese internment camps, 1942. It was carried out through Executive Order 1966. It took Japanese families away from their homes and into internment camps. It was motivated by racism and fear of spies. And the Supreme Court case, Korematsu v. United States, in 1944, said that the formation of Japanese internment camps were legal and constitutional. The Holocaust, 1933 to 1945. It was the Nazi genocide of the Jews under the orders of Hitler, and it occurred during World War II. The Jews were deemed racially inferior, therefore the Nazis had no hesitance in murdering, shooting, killing the Jews. The Nazis deemed themselves racially superior. So the Holocaust created various concentration camps like the Auschwitz, and this concentration camp was most famously known for the gas chambers that killed multitudes of Jews in a single time. Immigration throughout this period can be divided from the southern and eastern Europe and from Mexico. So from southern and eastern Europe, the immigration reached its peak before World War I, and from Mexico, Mexican immigrants had to face unfair treatment like the Mexican repatriation and the Bracero program. The Mexican repatriation sent legal Mexican citizens back to Mexico during the Great Depression and so forth. And the Bracero program only let in Mexicans for a short period of time because the United States, needed a hand for labor. The Democratic Party during this period became the majority party, and they supported the Keynesian economics. And because they supported the Keynesian economics, they also supported many social programs that were very liberal. So, APUSH period 8, starting from 1945, the end of the World War II, and until 1918, the election of Ronald Reagan. The suburban movement, 1940s to 1950s. It was a social legacy of the Depression, and several factors caused it. Mass demobilization after the war, great government involvement in housing and development, the mass marketing of the automobile, and a dramatic change in the demographics. An example of the suburban movement is Levittown. As you can see, there are identical houses. Soviet Union, 1922 to 1991. The communist ideology of the Soviet Union was to place the working class in charge of the government and make all property shared by the people. The Soviet Union was formed after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, and it ended Tsar rule in Russia. And as you can see, their flag consists of a sickle and a hammer, which signifies peasants. The Cold War. It started in 1947 until 1991. It was diplomatic tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. It divided much of the world into polarized camps, capitalist against communists. Rather than direct conflicts, proxy wars occurred like in Vietnam and Korea. The Korean War. It started in 1950 and continued until 1953. It was the first hot war of the Cold War. It began with the Soviet-backed North Korea's invasion in South Korea. It left Korea divided in North and South along the 38th parallel. It was the result of the containment policy by George F. Kennan to prevent the expansion of communism in other areas in the world. And Truman's limited war in the Korean War was the idea that the United States would not aim for full victory in Korea, but just gain partial victory, like leaving Korea divided into the Communist North and the Democratic South. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The victory was gained by Thurgood Marshall and NAACP. It overruled Plessy v. Ferguson, stating that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And the decision was made by the Warren Court, and the Warren Court is characterized by its democratic and liberal decisions throughout this period. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. It was against the Communist North. It was between the Communist North and the capitalist South. It was another example of the proxy war of the Cold War, and Americans opposed U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And events that occurred throughout the Vietnam War were the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, 1964, the My Lai Massacre, 1968, Nixon's Vietnamization policy, the Pentagon Papers, and Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Communist North. Nationalist movements, 1940s to the 1970s. It was the emergence of powerful nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, which led to both sides in the Cold War to seek allies among new nations. However, these nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East many remained unaligned. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. It outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It required equal access to public places and employment. It enforced desegregation of schools and the right to vote. However, unfortunately, it did not end discrimination. The Great Society, 1964 until 1969, it was initiated by the President LBJ Lyndon B. Johnson, and it was heavily influenced by liberalistic ideas and liberalism. The goal was to use federal legislation and programs to end racial discrimination, eliminate poverty, and address other social issues. Part of the organizations created during the Great Society were Medicaid, Medicare, and Head Start. Détente, 1969 to 1979. The Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence. Détente is characterized as the mutual, peaceful coexistence when the arms race was relaxed. And examples of détente can be Khrushchev's visit to U.S., the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, Nixon's visit to China, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT I. You can see Nixon and Khrushchev shaking hands together over here on the right. Martin Luther King, 1929 to 1968. He combated racial discrimination using legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolent protest tactics. So, these bullet points right on the bottom are some of them. Some of them are what MLK was part of, and some other are related parts of the African American movements. So MLK was part of the March on Washington, but not part of the. He supported the cause of the Montgomery bus boycott and the Greensboro lunch counter sit-ins, and he wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, and he took part in the Selma March. And another famous Black rights activist was Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP, so that you can't, whenever you find MLK, you can directly think of these factors. Latino, American Indian, Asian American movements, 1960s to 1970s. These people continued to demand social and economic equality and a redress of past injustices. Some examples are American Indian Movement, Indians of all tribes in the occupation of Alcatraz, Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, the Latino American movements, Delano Great Strike, and U.S. v. Wheeler. Feminist, gay, lesbian movements, 1960s to 1970s. These activists mobilized behind claims for legal, economic, and social equality. Some famous activists and examples of these movements are Betty Friedan and her feminist the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Stonewall Riots, the gay movement, National Organization for Women, Roe v. Wade, which protected the rights to privacy. And as you can see, this is Betty Friedan on the right. The Sun Belt Migration, 1970s. Higher education opportunities and new technologies rapidly expanded, therefore people started moving to this crescent. Increasing social mobility encouraged the migration of the middle class also, so these people moved to the suburbs, the south, and the west. So this Sun Belt region emerged as a significant political and economic force, and an example that drew the people to this region was the aerospace industry boom in the south and west. And the crescent is this region that I am pointing at right now. Evangelical churches and organizations, 1970s to 1980s. So, religious conservatives were people who supported socially conservative policies, like people who opposed the Great Society and the New Deal, etc. So, the rapid and substantial growth was accompanied by greater political and social activism on the part of religious conservatives. And examples of these organizations are Focus on Family and Moral Majority. The Middle East. So, U.S. relationship and intervention in this period, in period 8 in the Middle East, first can be characterized with OPEC. So, OPEC posed embargo in 1973, which created an energy crisis in the U.S. The OPEC nations doubled their petroleum charges in 1979, causing American inflation rise well above 13%. And U.S. intervention involvement in the Middle East can be best described as diplomatic, economic, and military involvement for U.S. interests. And this is it. This was period 7 till 8. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys all ace the actual college board. Thank you.